Well, welcome back to Counterpoints Friday, actually on a Friday this time, not Counterpoints Monday or Tuesday, but actually on Friday.
We even did a Wednesday. We still haven't done a Thursday.
That's right. Okay, so we're coming for Thursday. Thursday's not safe from us.
Stay away from Saturday and Sunday.
That's right. Also, our first Counterpoints Friday with a live studio audience of one.
That's right.
My mom is sitting about 10 yards away from us, and she is going to be somewhat of an ombudsman every time Ryan says something socialist about unions or the economy.
The audience has been prepped not to boo too loudly.
Yes, there won't be any booing, but it is sort of fun to have a little live studio audience.
Not sure why she has a little bucket of tomatoes there. But I think we might find out.
She brought eggs. Yes. All right. Well, our first topic today, we're going right in on the midterms. And I want to put this SOT up because Peter Doocy from Fox News pressed President Biden at a news conference this week. And I think the question he asks and the way Joe Biden responds opens up a bigger discussion about what's happening in the midterm elections. So let's go ahead and roll A1.
Top domestic issue, inflation or abortion?
All important. Unlike you, there's no one thing. It crosses the board. Domestic, ask me about foreign policy too. There's multiple issues, and they're all important. And we ought to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. You know that old expression. Thank you.
All right, Ryan, can they walk and chew gum at the same time? There's been a lot of chatter in the Beltway press over the last couple of weeks about whether Democrats have sort of handicapped themselves by focusing so much on the abortion issue because they felt they had the wind at their backs after the Dobbs ruling, that this was going to help them eat away at what was going to be a really positive turnout for Republicans in the fall with a bad economy. But is that actually the case? Do you think that's actually what's going on? Or do you think that Democrats really are walking and chewing gum at the same time, meaning that they can talk about both of those issues and they can target ads about abortion where it'll matter, and maybe not so much elsewhere?
I mean, I think Biden is right in the sense that people contain multitudes.
Right.
Like the idea that you have to choose between all of the different things that you care about. Like, well, I care about inflation, therefore I don't care about abortion. Or, hey, I care about abortion rights, pro or con, therefore I don't care about inflation. It's a question of salience, and it's a question of what moves people. Two things: what moves people to vote or not to vote,
right,
and what moves people to switch sides.
Right.
And pundits we'll find out on election night. I'm not terribly optimistic about Democrats' chances, but they have overperformed in basically every special election that we've had since the Dobbs ruling. Overperformed polls, overperformed expectations. And if they do end up overperforming, it will be because people, when they were asked what is the most important issue, they say, well, inflation. Like every single day I'm wondering for two reasons. One, I hear about inflation, on the car radio when I'm driving around, and I know that that's going to impact my 401k, which I've watched, 20%. A lot of people have 401ks. A lot of people have watched their 401ks nosedive. That bothers them, even if they're not going to retire for 10, 20, 30 years. It's like watching that happen gives you anxiety. Secondly, seeing prices rise, spending hundreds of more dollars a month that you don't have on things that you need.
Gas prices are going back up.
Gas prices going like so. So when you're asked what's the issue that's most important to you, you're going to respond to that. Also, there's tons of polling research that what the media is talking about then comes back to pollsters as the top issue.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Like, around the deficit, for instance. Like, nobody says the deficit. It used to be the number one issue was the deficit.
Yeah.
Did we solve the deficit? Is the deficit gone? Deficit's not top 30 anymore.
Isn't it amazing how that works?
Because the media doesn't talk about the deficit. And so people sometimes view these polls as quizzes. What's the correct answer? Well, I hear all the time about inflation, so therefore the correct answer to your question you're asking me, I'm smart, it's inflation.
Well, it's also just the conditioning, right? If you sort of exist in the media ecosystem as all of us do now, like you can't really tune it out. If you have social media, whatever, you're being bombarded with it, and that sort of conditions, that is the conditioning. I don't think people need to be conditioned in this case to worry immensely about inflation.
Same with abortion, and that's where the wild card could come in, because you could have a sizable number of people who are not a majority. It's not going to turn up to be the number one issue, but so many people are going to vote on that issue that might throw off these polls. Is the point? Because even if it's only 10%, like boom, that flips the apple cart of all all the punditry.
Well, so that actually also explains the way the parties are spending, because we talked about this earlier in the week. Midterm elections are largely about turnout. So if you are a party consultant and you're engineering election strategies in Ohio, Pennsylvania, wherever it is, Nevada perhaps, you're saying, how do I make sure every Democratic voter actually goes out and pulls the lever for a Democrat? And then it's also your job to bring in independents to the polls. And this is from an Axios report. It's from the Wesleyan Media Project. A university-backed political ad research group finds that the top issue mentioned in ads in Senate races across broadcast TV nationally from September 19th through October 2nd was abortion. And you can see where in the aggregate, if you're asking Joe Biden, can you walk and chew gum at the same time? The real question there are Democrats focusing on abortion to the detriment of inflation? And that is absolutely a real question. But if they're doing it smartly, and if Republicans are doing it smartly, and when Republicans run ads, this isn't just about Dem spending, this is also about Republican spending. If Republicans are doing it correctly, it's also as a motivating factor, saying Mark Kelly supports no restrictions on abortion. If that's the Republican line, that's what you want to be doing, not sort of blocking and tackling.
Yeah. Last night I watched the Jim Bognett, Matt Cartwright debate. It's in Northeast Pennsylvania.
Fun night in the Grimm house.
Yeah. I mean, it's my favorite congressional race. Maybe we can talk about it more next week. Matt Cartwright is, an old school populist Democrat, and watching him kind of parry the inflation blows from Bognett was what people on the left would love to see every Democrat do. He would just hit him back. He's like, look, and he even used the line that you hear on this show and elsewhere when Bognett would talk about Drag Queen Story Hour.
Right.
And he'd be like, look, here this guy goes with the culture war stuff again, just to try to distract you from the fact that his big donors are making record profits and profiteering and driving up prices.
Which was kind of how that Katie Porter video went viral this week. Did you see the Katie Porter video talking about, okay, so and again, that's true. We're going to talk a little bit about, in my monologue actually, about culture war and versus kind of economic issues, and how, in my opinion, they're often overlapping more than people realize. But to your point, it's incredible how Democrats don't pick up on the messaging of Cartwright. Like, why the National Party doesn't do that? Is it because
he's actually their vice chair for messaging or something, but they're still not listening to him?
Yeah. But they really aren't running like that.
Right.
Is it because they're a cozy new relationship with the Chamber of Commerce? I shouldn't say new. It's not entirely new.
I mean, a lot of them don't want to offend their own donors, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, or they're running in suburban districts maybe, where they don't want to be accused of being socialists or something like that.
Something. So it's not working. So let's pull up A2 here, which is 538 flagged on Twitter yesterday that Republicans, after trailing for a very, very long time in the generic congressional ballot, ticked up by 0.1%. So they're now up by 0.1% in the generic ballot. That is obviously not statistically significant, but the direction is significant. Like they have been trending upwards. Democrats have been trending downwards. As we get closer to the election, and actually ballots are already out, so we're in the midst of the election. Typically, the president's party starts to lose momentum heading into the people that are still on the fence at this point oftentimes swing over towards Republicans, and the polling is so bad that it's really hard to know. If you are either party at this point, if you're Republicans, you want to be up a couple points because Democrats had overperformed in all of these recent races. Although you have a gerrymandering, and geographical structural advantage where if there's a flat 50-50 vote, Republicans win the House.
Right.
If you're Democrats, though, you look at all of the polling misses in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, all over the country. You're like, we need a much bigger margin than we have right here.
Right. Well, and they're up like 3.4 in the aggregate, the RCP aggregate as well, 3.4 points. And that's it wasn't always that way. The trend is going higher as the last couple of weeks. The gap is getting higher as the last couple of weeks. And yeah, it's partially that. It's also partially where the money has gone. After Labor Day, people start spending big money in some of those races, and that what happens, I think, downstream of the money coming in is that people sort of realize what their messages actually are and have to be.
Right.
And as that kind of congeals, you see the efficacy of it. And gas prices are not helping Democrats right now at all. Obviously, inflation is a broader issue, but I think specifically gas prices went down a little bit. And that when the when the generic ballot was a little bit tighter, gas prices were a little bit lower. And so all of that sort of drives people in different directions.
And to the point I was making earlier about inflation and being concerned relative to the markets, too, let's put up a 3 here, which is you're getting signals from the Federal Reserve that they're not happy that their raising of interest rates has seemingly had so little effect on inflation. And so they're signaling that in their next several meetings, they're going to continue raising interest rates until they push it well over 4%, and then they're going to leave it there for most of the rest of the year. And this actually goes back to the conversation that we were having with Matt Stoller and Dave Dayen, I guess 2 weeks ago now, where Dave Dayen was making the argument that, okay, if it was true that raising rates was actually going to deal with the drivers of inflation, then okay, then let's have that conversation. If this tightening was going to do that in some way other than just massively ratcheting up unemployment, let's think about it. I think what we're seeing so far is evidence that Dayen is correct at this point, that the drivers of inflation are not the things that you can manipulate with tightening or loosening Fed policy. If it's supply chain driven, if it's drought driven, if it's driven by the war, if it's driven by sanctions on Russia, if it's driven by OPEC cutting the amount of oil that it's producing, the Federal Reserve monkeying around with its Fed funds rates isn't going to affect any of that stuff other than savagely depressing the economy and throwing so many people out of work that eventually, as a knock-on effect, those prices come down. And so what you're seeing here is that they're like, well, I guess we're just going to have to keep doing it. And maybe then it'll rain in California. Or maybe then the war in Russia will end. Or maybe then we won't be seeing heat waves in India. Or I feel like they're so divorced from the reality of the economy that they don't recognize this, something that Brad DeLong in his recent book was pointing out, which is that if you think of inflation, people talk about it, heating up. If you think, or a fever, like if you think of the purpose of a fever, like a fever, and this is kind of the new medicine that the pediatricians have been telling us. Like if the fever's below like 101, 100 or so, let it run, because the fever has a purpose.
Rub some dirt in it.
Yeah, rub some dirt in it. You let it run if it gets higher, then you need to seek like serious intervention. But if it's running at 100, 101, there's a reason the body's doing that. The body is heating itself up so that the heat then, is an immunoresponse and pushes down whatever the problem was and beats it. So as soon as you see a little tiny spike in a fever, you take Advil, then that allows the virus to just, oh, sweet, no immune response. I can just rock and roll here for a while. You'll feel better. And so inflation is a signal to the economy that something's off. In the early part of the pandemic, the inflation was a signal that the supply chains were completely broken. So you can either then invest as a society and figure out a way to fix those supply chains and then bring that fever down, or you can just dump a bunch of Advil, which is saying, well, the problem is too many people are buying things, and people have money because they have jobs, so therefore we need to throw people out of work. So then when they don't have jobs, they won't be able to buy things, and then that will fix the supply chains. Except you didn't fix the supply chains. You still have your same supply chains, so that the next time then you have economic growth again, you're going to have another supply chain crisis because you never fixed it.
That's our entire economy. It's like Band-Aids over Band-Aids over Band-Aids that are often crony Band-Aids, but it's just like Band-Aids layered on top of other Band-Aids, and that's why when people say we have this like wonderful free market system, and I'm talking about people on the right, no, right. We have a wonderful free market system, but for cronies. But the other thing I was going to say to that point is, in this case, it is somewhat complicated by the reality that to invest in those fixes, the spending can be inflationary too. And so it's just a kind of a lose-lose. being you're between a rock and a hard place, basically.
And so if that 538 forecast of a 0.1% advantage for Republicans in the midterms comes to be, you're going to have a Speaker, Kevin McCarthy. And if we can put up B1 here, Emily Chichinsky has a profile of Kevin McCarthy, just ran in the Federalist. So tell us what was your impression of Kevin McCarthy?
I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with Kevin McCarthy. Remember, he is he's a young gun, right? Remember that hilarious photo shoot and book with Eric Cantor, Paul Ryan, and Kevin McCarthy.
That was incredible.
From 2010 or 2011. It looks like a Men's Warehouse ad. And so he sort of came up under Boehner, under Ryan, very much an establishment fixture, who is now on really good terms with Jim Jordan. He is now on really good terms with basically the entire Freedom Caucus. He's on decent terms with Donald Trump. And so here's this question of how did this establishment fixture navigate the Trump era in a way where he emerges as the last young gun standing? He's the one that managed to actually have really good relationships with people like Jim Jordan, Donald Trump, while also having good relationships with the establishment, continuing to have a good relationship with the establishment. It's an interesting question, and it's not to say that Kevin McCarthy is brilliant or dumb, although Politico ran a piece earlier this year asking, is Kevin McCarthy a dummy, a giant dummy?
Is he a dummy?
No, he's not. And I think that's really what's interesting here is that he's very savvy and he's such a people person that the Republican caucus feels very heard by him, which goes a long way when you need to sort of unite people and get all of their votes for Speaker. So all that is to say, we are likely to see a Speaker Kevin McCarthy. In the story, I have a Freedom Caucus source basically saying that is not done and dusted, is what he says. Politico also had a piece saying Kevin McCarthy, Freedom Caucus is totally behind him. I don't think that's the case, but I think he's going to have to make some concessions. In the story, Rachel Bovard talks about how Nancy Pelosi basically blew up a lot of precedents, and by her own admission. She said we had to blow up those precedents essentially to deal with the threat of Trumpism, to deal with the threat of the insurrection, et cetera, et cetera. So that means Republicans want Kevin McCarthy to fight fire with fire. He's going to boot Adam Schiff, Eric Swalwell from the Intelligence Committee. He's going to boot Ilhan Omar from Foreign Affairs if he is Speaker, if Republicans win. He's not ready to talk about impeachment yet. That's one thing that has a lot of people on the right kind of riled up. They wish he would come out guns a-blazing and go for Mayorkas, go for Merrick Garland. He says he'll do it if something occasions impeachment. But he's really walking a tightrope, and he could slip and fall at any moment, but he's been doing this for years, and I think it's worth paying attention to.
What do they want to do Garland for? The letter about the parents in Virginia?
Well, that's, to start with that, yeah. And then
really
all of the other FBI,
FBI
corruption.
stuff.
Yeah, okay. Generally it would all come down to FBI corruption.
Gotcha. You had an interesting anecdote about Jim Jordan because it is, and I think that a lot of liberals have not picked up on the fact that Kevin McCarthy has really ingratiated himself with the right. And so they keep thinking, oh, he's not going to be able to handle the right. It's like, no, actually, if you follow the caucus or the conference, it's so annoying that it's a Democratic caucus and a Republican conference. The Republicans in the House call themselves a conference. Democrats are a caucus, and actually
I call them a caucus too, though.
There's actually supposed to be a meaningful distinction between the two. A caucus is supposed to vote together, where a conference is like people who are conferring, right, but are still individuals. But they're not actually. They're a caucus now. So let's call them a caucus. So the Republican caucus is actually pretty united behind Kevin McCarthy. It seems at this point, as Rachel said in your piece, the Freedom Caucus doesn't really have the juice to take him out. You had this interesting anecdote about Jim Jordan and how he kind of jammed him onto the Oversight Committee against the wishes of the committee. How do you do that, and what's been the fallout from that?
Yeah, there hasn't been fallout, which is what's so interesting. It's like he tells the story about how after Jim Jordan ran against him for Speaker, he said he called Jordan up. I think they were freshman congressmen together. He called Jordan up. Jordan was working out at the gym, and Kevin McCarthy said, "Listen, you got to get down here. I need you to be oversight chair. You're the best person for the job."
Look, it's work hours. What are you doing?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know what was in the I don't know what hours the steering committee keeps. So, but Jordan comes down and gives his presentation to the Oversight Committee or to the steering committee, and they erupt, is what Kevin McCarthy said. The steering committee
erupted in a negative way.
On Kevin McCarthy for bringing Jordan in. McCarthy says, "You elected me to lead. let me lead, sticks his neck out for Jordan. Jordan does what, just by all accounts, everybody on the right believes was a great job in oversight. And Kevin McCarthy sees that as a real success point. And Jim Jordan is really his bridge to the Freedom Caucus. But as we talked about with Ken Buck earlier this week, it's possible that bridge could break if the Freedom Caucus gets annoyed enough with Jordan over their disagreements on big tech stuff. Who knows if that happens, but it's another thing to watch out for. But yeah, I mean, Kevin McCarthy has been very intentional. He is not Paul Ryan. He is surely not John Boehner. And that's an interesting point that you raised about how on the left, I don't think people recognize how sincere, it's another story from the piece, which very quickly Jim Jordan talks about, and Kevin McCarthy talks about how that first impeachment of Donald Trump, they did not lose a Republican vote. And they've lost Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney on January 6th stuff, but that's pretty remarkable given where we know Republicans are sort of behind closed doors when it comes to Donald Trump, right?
And also when it comes to sending weapons to Ukraine and national security behind closed doors,
Exactly.
which was what that impeachment was about.
Exactly. And so for him to be able to do that was a feat. And Jim Jordan talks about how that really brought the conference together. McCarthy saw that as a moment that really brought the conference together. The way I described it, it's like when you're on a high school field trip, like maybe you're going somewhere big and fancy and something goes really wrong on the trip and everyone becomes best friends because it's like trauma bonding. That's basically how Republicans would describe their experience with the first impeachment and keeping everybody together. And that is strategically a testament to McCarthy's leadership. Now, to your point, Ryan, he had some interesting comments this week to Punch Bowl, where he said, we're basically not going to be giving a blank check to Ukraine in January because people are seeing a recession. They're going through a recession. They're dealing with high levels of inflation. What they're not going to want to see from us is a blank check to Ukraine. This gets blown up into a whole thing about how Republicans are now this like isolationist, Jacksonian party. But what did you make of McCarthy weighing in on Ukraine, especially with the news that you wanted to discuss briefly about Kherson?
Oh, right. So there isn't a development yet on this incoming battle of Kherson, but the Ukrainian government has now kind of put a blackout around all of their operations around the Kherson region, and they're telegraphing that there's going to be a major assault on Kherson in the next several days. Could start today, as far as we know. It's running along the same pattern that as we saw with the assault on the Eastern Front. What was that, a month ago or so? Kherson is the only kind of regional capital that Russia was able to take. Putin has declared martial law there. He has illegally annexed the region, and if it falls so quickly after that, it'll be a huge blow to Putin. And the authorities who are currently controlling Kherson have urged all civilians to evacuate so that they can fortify the city, bracing for this coming assault. And so it does feel like this could be a battle that tells you where this is heading. Mm-hmm. That if they get repulsed and then they head into a winter with most of their power stations out, and with Europe growing sick of their own kind of travails at the expense of this war. Yeah. And if you have McCarthy right, take power in January, Putin may feel like, okay, I've got this. If I can just hold on, I've got this. If they take Kherson, then the rest of the war seems foretold in a way.
Tell me more about that.
That from there, I could just see everything just collapsing.
Dominoes.
Yeah, I mean, because if they can't hold the most significant piece that they grabbed, right, then what? Then you keep saying, well, you see kind of supporters of the Russian war effort saying, don't dismiss this war. They seized 30% of territory, and they still hold 20% of territory. And then they're gonna be like, well, they hold 18% of, they hold 15%, they hold 10% of Ukrainian territory. And at that point, you're like, morale is so important that you can, if you see which direction things are going, then you could imagine these different, these different fortifications just saying, you know what, I'm not here for this.
Well, and on this point, a really interesting, this is from Morning Consult, which says they're tracking, quote, shows the share of Republicans who say the U.S. is doing too much to halt Russia's invasion of Ukraine has doubled from 13% to 27%.
So 27% of people say the U.S. is doing too much.
That was from March to May. So those are somewhat outdated numbers, but you can see that doubling really quickly. And that's very, very interesting. And that's where you start to see this creeping into Republican rhetoric and perhaps into Republican policy. Now, Mitch McConnell is very hawkish and is all in on sending a lot of money to Ukraine. Obviously, if Ukraine is able to, have a bulwark militarily, that's coming from heavily coming from U.S. funding. And so it's heavily reliant on their ability to have Mitch McConnell persuade, a Republican Party or a Kevin McCarthy to be on board with that. And to your point, Ryan, one thing I always see happening in Washington is you can always make the case for the next step, the next spending, the next increment, and the next bill, because this is about Kherson. And if Kherson goes, then you have a domino effect. And that's something the Republicans are going to have to deal with, I think.
Or they might not, because I could see a scenario where in the lame duck, let's say Republicans have taken over both chambers or they took over just the House. I could see in the lame duck Pelosi on her way out sitting down with Schumer and McConnell and saying, here come the crazies, like, let's write a blank check. Well, or not necessarily a blank check, but how about another $50 billion? Like that should get it. Or another $100 billion. We're not going to spend it all, but here's $100 billion that's available. I could absolutely see that happening. And all it has to do is get through the House. And then once it gets to the Senate, like you said, McConnell and enough Republicans, you've got people like Portman and Blunt and other retiring Republicans, that breezes through. And then McCarthy can say he's not going to send any more money. It won't matter, which actually probably would be his preference. Like if you could, if you could speak to him completely privately about it, he probably wants to send money there, but doesn't want his fingerprints on the money. Because if you notice, he said
special interests want us to spend money in Ukraine.
And so do a lot of the hawkish donors in the Republican Party that are left. The base doesn't necessarily want it, but a lot of the donors
that
do.
might be changing. But you're right.
Some of that, some do, some don't. But you notice his phrasing. He said, we're not going to send a blank check. That's different than saying we're not going to send money.
We're not going to send a check is a different.
We'll send a check, and it is shameful that that there have not been strings attached, that there has not been oversight put on this money. We're going to see these weapons, all over the world, and you're going to see enormous amounts of it skimmed. You're also obviously seeing enormous amounts of it fired at the Russian military and at their positions. So it's not as if nothing's being done with the weapons. But so McCarthy, I think, would still sign off on significant military aid, but there would be like money for the IG.
There's basically evidence that there are cracks in the foundation that really has not had cracks in it. Pat Buchanan, I don't think, really put cracks in it, but maybe tiny little hairline fractures that are now opening up into cracks in the sort of neoconservative foundation of the Republican Party. Actually, that's
there was a quote that you were highlighting earlier. Who was that from about how you're never going to have a hawkish Republican Party again?
That's exactly why you should stay tuned for the next segment, because it is indeed in the article that we're about to talk about.
Excellent. Stick around for that.
Well, that's right. We can start with it right now. It is, if we can put C1 up, this is a story that was in a very long and in-depth kind of profile of the Republican Party's struggles with those cracks in the foundation that we talked about in the last segment, when you start to have people like Kevin McCarthy saying, well, we're not going to send a blank check to Ukraine, which, as Ryan points out, is different than a check. So the headline here is, the neocons are losing. Why aren't we happy? Ryan, the quote that you're referencing, that you referenced in the last block, comes from Kevin Roberts of the Heritage Foundation, who's saying that, and I'm paraphrasing this, we are unlikely to ever have a hawkish Republican president again because the movement has shifted. And he's quoted in the New Republic article as saying that, and let me just read one quote that I think encapsulates the argument of the New Republic piece. It says, the Jacksonian moment is coming in preventing overreach and curbing the default hawkishness that still predominates in Washington Washington, this is a welcome development. But with their hostility to alliances, diplomacy, and internationalism, the Jacksonians may make U.S. foreign policy unnecessarily ruthless and selfish while making new enemies and destroying some of our greatest strengths. From somebody on the left, do you share those concerns about creeping isolationism? And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense on the right.
I'm all for isolation. Let it creep as much as it can creep.
I thought you were going to say that.
Jackson, but why do they go to Jackson? Why do they go to Jackson? Jackson,
it's always Jackson.
Jackson became president, because he disobeyed orders and invaded Spanish Florida. That was the thing that kind of put him on the map. His absolute genocide of the Native American population was central, to his entire political rise. And so, did he? So he didn't go to war with Britain or something, and so that counts as he didn't go to war with Mexico. He left that for other people.
He's just always been that avatar of.
And so they call him an isolationist.
Right. When neoconservatives want to punch at the isolationist right, they go to Jackson.
Oh, the neoconservatives go to Jackson.
Yeah, when they want to create a sort of straw man, they go to Jackson.
Why don't they go to La Follette, the actual Republican isolationist?
You're asking the wrong person.
Weird.
Well, he wasn't president.
No, he wasn't president, but he was kind of the leading isolationist Republican in the early part of the 20th century. And that movement was really kind of smashed to bits by World War II.
Yes, it sure was.
And it took until Pat Buchanan really to start kind of showing some green shoots.
Well, and it did, and this is, I think, a bigger question about, we lose perspective on how new nuclear technology is and the very immediate, urgent new threat that nuclear technology posed to the world, not just North America, not just the European continent, in the mid-century, right after World War II, informed what became neoconservatism. And this isn't to endorse neoconservatism, it's merely to say that it's pretty understandable at the time that if you have missiles in Cuba, there's sort of a real reason to deter that and to be doing preventative action. And the sort of Reagan idea of peace through strength, of building up to the point where you are deterring the use of nuclear weapons, because we had children doing nuclear things under their desks, doing nuclear emergency drills under their desks.
Now we traumatize our kids just with shooting drills.
We traumatize them in so many ways now. But yes, that is among many ways we traumatize them. And so the sort of broader question of neoconservatism, I think, is more understandable with that aperture. But at the same time, right now, what we see is the wreckage of decades of neoconservative policy around the world, not just in the United States. Of course, not just in the United States, very much around the world. And with that in the rearview mirror, this new sort of nuclear threat emerges at an entirely different context.
And it is interesting that you're seeing this kind of populist isolationism emerge in a similar cauldron as it did 100 years ago, the wake of the Gilded Age. We're in a.
Oh, that is interesting.
Everybody says we're in a second Gilded Age, and so it would make sense that the characteristics of the first Gilded Age would be reproducing themselves here, and you could see why in the first Gilded Age, you'd say, look, any war that's being fought right now is being fought on behalf of the plutocrats, the J.P. Morgan, the Chase. It would same plutocrats today would be the ones that people would see themselves as fighting on behalf of.
Arguably much worse plutocrats today, if it's possible.
I don't know. Those were some pretty bloodthirsty plutocrats back then, and also it's what they're capable of getting away with.
Yeah, that's very true.
So they're constrained a little bit by their era. I think that's a significant part of it. That again, the collapse of the social contract results in people then not trusting their leadership, and if one decent outcome from that is that they don't want to join those leaders in wars, okay, I guess let's take that.
Yeah, it's that comparison is really interesting because what we pejoratively refer to as isolationism now, when it came to the First World War, was pretty much public opinion, and it took a long time. And
Wilson ran on he kept us out of the war.
Right. Well, and you remember
then
when George
immediately
W.
went to
Bush
war.
ran
Yeah.
on keeping us out of foreign conflicts? What was the phrase that he used? Nation building?
Right, we're not going to do nation building, just to destroy nations.
Right.
So he kept that promise.
Right.
He did not build any nations.
We will not be
Yes.
building. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. That is a really interesting comparison. And there was this huge influx, obviously, of European immigration around the time of the Gilded Age, which informed why people didn't necessarily want to be entangled in foreign conflicts as well. There was like a lot going on at that time, but this kind of hubris of the post-World War II order was informed by a really strong economy and a very strong post-war economy that was built on a war in so many different ways, and there's nothing like that right now at all. If anything, we've been spending so much money in the defense sector abroad that we have empty sort of we have a tattered social safety net here.
One piece of fun trivia to finish off this block. To your point about immigrants and war, the way that World War I was sold was through anti-German hostility.
Yes.
And so there was tons of propaganda against beer because beer was considered to be German. And prohibition came about, significantly as a result of all of the propaganda against Germans to get us into World War I. They're like, well, then let's just go ahead and ban it all.
This isn't trivia to somebody from Milwaukee, Ryan. The whole history of the German beer movement, it is pretty interesting.
Wisconsin always went first with Social Security, with
Socialism.
unemployment, with socialism. Did they ban? They didn't ban beer first, though. Because too many Germans. Right?
I'd highly doubt that. We were actually the last state, I think, to give in to the federal 21 drinking age, and they did that with the
highway money.
The highway money, yeah, federal funding for highways. You really had to poke at us to get us to go along with that fascism.
We'd rather have potholes than not allow our 18-year-olds to drink.
Hell yeah. All right. On that note, moving on to a much more serious topic. Actually, we have some disturbing footage out of Florida that Ryan, I know you want to talk about.
So the Tampa Bay Times obtained body cam footage of the arrests, and they posted 3 different arrests. We're going to play a couple of them here of people who are being charged with voter fraud. And as you watch these videos, you're going to see that what you're looking at, to me, feels like state entrapment. These are people who, there was a referendum that restored felon voter rights in Florida. The DeSantis administration attached a bunch of different conditions and that made it so that you weren't automatically allowed to come back in. It also held exceptions for murder and for sex crimes, and so. But the entire thing is so confusing because of all the different red tape that was thrown up around it. You'll see one of these people, the DMV, just said, "Hey, you can register to vote now." These people all got voter registration cards from the state. They were on the rolls. They went to vote, and then the state goes and rounds them up. And so, I would encourage people to watch these clips before they jump and comment and say something asinine like, "Well, if you don't want to get arrested for voter fraud, don't do voter fraud." Watch it first. If you still want to say something asinine, watch it first and then say it. So let's roll some of this.
I have to go to first appearance, nothing like that. So
I didn't do it.
Okay. So, ma'am, we have a warrant for your arrest.
For what?
For voter fraud.
good, how are you, sir?
Right?
Oh my God. Hold on.
Wait.
Let me tell my husband.
We're telling him he's right here.
Phone right here. So if you can put your hands behind your back, please.
Oh my God.
Do
So,
not move.
ultimately, ma'am, you have a warrant? Okay. The
No,
warrant.
well-
Listen, hold on, listen. I know you caught off guard, I understand. Right? So you have a warrant, it's for voter fraud, okay? Hear me out. It's an ROR. You know what an ROR is?
Oh my God.
You go in, you get booked, and then they're going to release you from booking.
You can go right out.
You're going to be right back out. Okay?
Right back
But you have a warrant.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm like, voter fraud. I voted, but I ain't commit no fraud.
Well, so that's the thing. I don't know exactly what happened with it, but you do have a warrant. That's what it's for. Okay?
Oh my God.
Yeah, so I don't know what happened with that, but...
I got out. The guy told me that I was free and clear to go vote or whatever, because I done my time.
Yep.
I was free.
But the warrant was just made yesterday, so...
The guys talked to me 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, I know. I don't know, man. I honestly couldn't tell you. Okay. So I gotta do some paperwork, and the quicker I can get the paperwork done, the quicker I can get you there. Okay.
Hey, unfortunately, you got a warrant out, okay?
Warrant? What
Yes, sir. You want to put your hands behind your back for me?
Well, no, but no one ever really explained all that much to me. I told the guys when they came out here that I was at the driver's license place, getting my new driver's license. Yeah. The guy there asked me, he says, hey, can you vote? He says, hey, are you ready to vote? I said, no, I'm a convicted felon. I'm pretty sure I can. He goes, well, are you still on probation? I said, no. I got off probation like a month ago. He goes, well, then you can probably vote. Hey, just fill out the form, and if you can vote, then they'll let you give you a card. If you can't vote, then you won't. And I'm like, all right.
And there's your defense. You know what I'm saying?
That
sounds like a loophole to me.
So, well, we can hope.
Yes, sir. Will do.
It's because of the sex offender thing that you can't vote. So, I mean, the warrant is for the voting deal, I guess, but... I guess it's kind of all tied together. Yeah, I guess they're doing like some kind of roundup thing or something for all the ones that were within the county.
Yeah, I had to do one of these this morning already.
Oh, really?
Do you know the statutes for them?
It doesn't say it on the...
Let's walk over to my car, okay?
Why is y'all doing this now and this happened years ago?
I don't know. I have no idea, man.
This shit crazy, man. Y'all put me in jail for something I didn't know nothing about. Why would y'all let me vote if I wasn't able to vote?
So those are officers with the police force that Ron DeSantis created called the Florida Office of Election Crimes and Security. It was part of, I believe, 18 arrests. DeSantis followed it with a press conference. Like, this was clearly a coordinated sweep. And I think my posting of the video and us doing it here is what Ron DeSantis wants. I think he wants to chill the get out the vote operate. Like, he wants people to be afraid of voting, that if they go out and vote, there's a chance that they don't really understand the rules. And yes, there was a felon voter restoration law, but it's complicated, and so maybe you actually can't vote. And so, if is it really worth it? You really want to go out there and vote because you might wind up getting handcuffed. I saw this to me was just, as I said on the post, just struck me as just deeply evil. To you want to play your culture war games in a press conference or whatever, do your culture war games, but to then bring it to people's front steps, put them in handcuffs when they thought they were able to vote, and also to do it in a way that is completely unbalanced. Like, there were a couple Republicans that were in, I think, South Florida, who were caught voting twice on purpose. They knew they voted twice.
I remember that, yeah.
Right. And what did they get? Like a little community service or something. Or they had to go to a class to teach them not to vote twice. Like, they are not getting charged with felonies. I don't know. What was your take on this?
So, I mean, the law, I believe, is very clear that you have to have intent. And the intent is what comes through. The lack of intent is what comes through on all of those videos. And so I think it was something like 20 people were arrested in this, as you heard one of the officers say, it's some kind of roundup,
right.
is what he said. And that question of intent is clearly an important one. If you were listening in the podcast format, this was a video from the Tampa Bay Times, and they put a text over it at one point that said everyone who was arrested was given a voter registration card. And the one man in particular, he was saying he was at the DMV getting a new driver's license, and somebody said, "Hey, you probably can vote."
And he even raised, "Well, I'm not.
I'm a felon.
I'm a felon." Like, well, as long as you're not on probation anymore. Now, that was the guy who had a sex crime, and look, those are not sympathetic people. You're guilty.
No,
you went to prison for a sex crime. That doesn't make you a sympathetic figure.
Well, these figures are all people who went to prison for murder and sex crimes.
Right.
Everyone that you just saw there.
Right.
The woman.
Right. And which is a tried and true tactic of government forces, is to try to find if you're going to try to violate a sacred principle, like the right to vote, you're going to find the least sympathetic character so that people will then not stand up for that person. It's one reason that when governments around the world, and particularly the United States government, wants to crack down on press freedom, they go after Julian Assange. Because the rest of the news media is like, well, we don't even think of him as a journalist. We don't like him. He's a jerk. Like, personally, we don't like him.
Right.
And so then people will say, well, I'm for press freedom, but that guy's a jerk. So I'm not going to stand up and defend that person because screw them.
Right.
And then boom, you're just allowing your rights to be chipped away at. No, you don't. Governments don't target the most popular person when they're trying to roll back your rights. That's why it's so important, if you're standing up for a principle, that you have to defend it even when it's unpopular.
Exactly. Judge me by how I treat the least among us, and that's a key principle, obviously. But the other thing I would add to this is, it's very frustrating, and I don't think it's even tactically smart, the Republican focus on voter fraud. So this idea that you have illegal people that are like intentionally voting illegally, as opposed to, I actually think there are serious questions about ballot harvesting. I think there are serious questions about the way that billionaires, Democratic billionaires, poured money into, especially the 2020 election, with this operation that was, made it easier for all of this to happen, laid the groundwork, as Mark Elias did in states like Wisconsin, to have the money sort of smooth the path for Democratic candidates. I think that stuff is actually very worth talking about. I think it's very worth talking about just the basic sanctity and the security of a person going in and casting a secret ballot. All of those things, very legitimate room for inquiry there.
And
but when it turns into
the security of our voting tabulation, from foreign hacking.
100%. Yeah, using, especially as we gravitate towards new technologies. I think these are very legitimate areas of inquiry. When it goes into stuff like this, listen, I don't think this is going to hurt Ron DeSantis one bit. I don't think there's a real political liability for all of the reasons you just listed. But I also don't think it's tactically a good use of either a good use of your political resources, or even just your resources as a state. Of course, I don't think that, but I don't think it's a good use of your political capital either. And so it's just very frustrating to see people get caught in the mix.
Yeah, and this is the second time that one of his stunts has involved kind of fundamentally transforming the lives of just normal people. Because there's still an ongoing investigation about the way, how did he get these Venezuelans in Texas onto a charter plane?
Although that I think is increasingly vindicated. I'm following that investigation very closely, and I think it's increasingly vindicating for DeSantis. So maybe we can do a segment on this in the next week or so. But it was pretty clearly all voluntary, and going to Martha's Vineyard, pretty clearly that was communicated. The more we learn about it, as far as we know. What I'm still curious about is whether there was false information given to people about guarantees of housing and work.
And also the money that he got from the Florida legislature to do this was for people who were in Florida illegally.
Yes.
Texas is not Florida. So he had to fly them into Florida?
He did do that.
So he flew them from Texas to Florida.
It's a stunt.
Now they're in Florida. Now I can spend the money on it. So it's
100% a stunt.
Bro.
And I don't know where the bulk of his resources in this election security what force have been spent. But that's exactly the thing that you risk sort of going over the line when you do these stunts, to the point where now you're just wasting taxpayer money. And politicians, I'm coming at this from the perspective that politicians engage in stunts, period, no matter who they are, and just sort of gauging this or grading this from the pure cold political strategy perspective. That is absolutely where you risk really pissing people off.
Yeah, and I'm saying a stunt is one thing. Don't destroy regular civilians' lives who aren't involved in this.
Absolutely. Well, Ryan, what point do you want to make today?
So, a firestorm around a Boston University research paper has exposed dangerous gaps in public oversight of the type of research that has the potential to spark new pandemics. So, the controversy began when the UK's Daily Mail reported on a public preprint describing BU research that took the spike protein from the highly contagious Omicron variant of COVID-19 and attached it to the more virulent earlier iteration of the virus known as the Washington State variant or the wild type. Now, we covered this controversy earlier this week, but since then, BU has really dug in, and it's worth examining their response because it's a window into how unresponsive some in the scientific community have been to the public's very real concerns about the safety and wisdom of some of this research. So the researchers infected 10 mice with the newly created virus. 8 of them died. After the news broke, the public controversy took an unusual turn with unexpectedly sharp public comments made by officials from Anthony Fauci's NIH division, NIAID, directed toward the researchers. The agency told Stat News they would have reviewed the research had they been alerted to it and that a probe was now underway. BU responded with a public statement that rejected the notion that the researchers had any obligation to alert the agency and said that while NIAID was thanked for support of research that built the groundwork for this project, this particular research wasn't directly funded by NIH, therefore, there was no disclosure requirement. Now, the extent of the misleading information included in Boston University's defense of its research and its lack of transparency serves as evidence that the public health community either does not recognize the severe blow its credibility has taken the past 2 years or feels that it is immune from that loss of credibility. A closer look at the statement reveals the distance still left to go to regain trust and guarantee a safer research environment. So let's take it piece by piece. So the statement's first claim is this. They say, first, this research is not gain-of-function research, meaning it did not amplify the Washington State SARS-CoV-2 virus strain or make it more dangerous. In fact, this research made the virus replicate less dangerous. Now that, according to Dr. Mark Lipsitch, who is director of Harvard's Center for Communicable Disease Dynamics, is preposterous. BU's claim that the new virus is, quote, less dangerous is a reference to the fact that the original virus killed 10 of 10 mice, while the lab-created virus killed just 8 of 10 infected mice. But the key there is that the mice were deliberately infected. So while the pathogen was slightly less lethal in mice, the expected result of attaching the more effective Omicron spike protein to the Washington State virus would be to make the original virus more infectious. If many more people or mice get infected, that result overwhelms the tiny decline in case fatality rate. So here's Lipsitch. These are unquestionably gain-of-function experiments. The wild-type backbone virus gains immune escape from the insertion of the Omicron spike in ways that the paper describes in detail. That is gain-of-function. Now, because the research was being done on viruses already in circulation around the world, the risk of creating a dangerous novel virus was actually kind of low. But the false claims from BU are important because they reflect on the inability of researchers to self-regulate, Lipsitch noted, which means the government needs to step in with more rigorous oversight. He said, quote, the statement from BU is disturbing in several ways. First, it denies that this is gain-of-function. It is gain-of-function. If meant sincerely, this is disturbing from the institution that did the research because it provides prima facie evidence that institutions are not equipped to self-regulate, unquote. So next, BU makes the following claim. Secondly, the research was reviewed and approved by the Institutional Biosafety Committee, which consists of scientists as well as local community members. The Boston Public Health Commission also approved the research. Okay, but in fact, according to a BPHC spokesperson, the researchers submitted their proposal and it was approved by the Public Health Commission in March 2020. Now, of course, there was no Omicron in March 2020. Therefore, quite simply, the research that was actually performed was not, in fact, approved ahead of time. Various experts have made this point publicly, though there's no need for me to quote them here. We all understand, at least on a very elementary level, the nature of time. Now, Boston University's statement then explains why it was not required to inform NIH of what it was up to. We fulfilled all required regulatory obligations and protocols. Following NIAID's guidelines and protocols, we did not have an obligation to disclose this research for 2 reasons. The experiments reported in this manuscript were carried out with funds from Boston University. NIAID funding was acknowledged because it was used to help develop the tools and platforms that were used in this research. They did not fund this research directly. NIH funding was also acknowledged for a shared instrumentation grant that helps support the pathology studies. We believe that funding streams for tools do not require an obligation to report, unquote. Okay, but according to the BU researchers preprint, they said, quote, this work was supported by Boston University startup funds, National Institutes of Health, NIAID grants. And then they list the grant numbers. And then the paper also acknowledges support from the Boston University Clinical and Translational Science Institute, and they list the grant number for that as too. So that's 5 grants. Now, microbiologist Richard Ebright noted that of the 5 grants acknowledged, only 2 were for equipment and 3 were for research. One grant provided $750,000. Another one gave CTSI $4.6 million for clinical research, clinical trials, and supportive activities. And the third gave $437,000 for research titled Regulation of Host Innate Immunity Against Viral Infection, unquote. So even setting aside the dubious argument that public funding of the tools used to do research doesn't entitle the same public to knowledge of what research is being done, and setting aside the false claim that no gain of function was involved, even on its own terms, the BU claim that only tools were funded is called into question by those 3 grants. After I sent those grants to BU, Rachel Cavalario, a BU spokesman, told me, quote, the link you shared is a different paper research and is the tools and platforms referenced. But as Lipsitch explained, if the research grants don't describe the precise research in question, that fact should not get BU off the hook, but instead that fact is actually evidence of the way the system is broken and in need of reform. The second reason they cite as excusing them from reporting obligations is a repeat of the claim that no gain of function was involved. We already dealt with that claim. So let's stipulate what a lot of virologists are saying, and I'll just leave it here, that the research was actually not that risky necessarily, because basically everybody's already had either the wild type or Omicron. It's been outcompeted by other ones. So if you create this other bug and you accidentally spilled it into Boston, wouldn't actually be that bad. Like that's the argument you're getting.
Then why do it in a high security lab?
Well, why? Yeah, just let everybody get it.
Yeah.
Because it would be unpleasant to get it, maybe. Let's even say that's true. The reaction from BU here and from their backers in the scientific community is so troubling. Because they didn't spark a pandemic with this. Imagine if they potentially did spark a pandemic. You could see all the digging of heels in that would go on. Just quibbling with definitions, saying that, oh yeah, you funded this microscope over here, but you didn't fund this microscope. Yeah, you funded my morning hours, but you didn't fund my afternoon hours, and it was the afternoon that I was working on the paper.
Yes.
It's like, what are you talking about?
Yes. No, and this is what's, I think, really frustrating about it is they're playing the same game that you see Fauci play whenever he's in a spat with Rand Paul.
And even Fauci's not putting up with this one, although he's leaving.
Well, yeah, but it's this very, there are 2 very real things going on here. One, which is that absolutely you and I are not scientists and are completely upfront about that fact. And, The Intercept has had some of the best reporting on gain of function and on potential lab leaks, et cetera, and where federal funding is going towards that stuff. So, yeah, I mean, you can do your work as a reporter, but you're not a doctor, and that does matter. But on the second hand, they take advantage of that to hide behind super academic, just abstruse definitions of gain of function, and they can they take advantage of the fact that the public cannot be as educated as they are because they're actual medical doctors and they're academics and researchers. So they're taking advantage of it. It's true on the one hand that there are a lot of people sounding off playing Monday morning quarterback who don't know what they're talking about, and we can do as much research as we can. We're not going to have the same knowledge of medical doctors, but then they're also taking advantage of that and exploiting it to do what they think is best, even if it's against the public's wishes. And even if it is legitimately not in the public's best interest, they're not elected,
Right, and I sent the follow-up statement that BU sent me to Richard Ebright, the microbiologist, and said, hey, they're saying that this research that's described here is just tools and it's just supportive and it doesn't have anything to do. And he wrote back, his comment was, if the NIH is telling you that, or if BU is telling you that NIH funding did not play a role in this, they're lying to you and they're doing so brazenly. Which is rare for in general scientists to speak with that level of that level of confidence around a particular issue. The last point I'd make is that Mark Lipsitch here commented, coming out publicly the way he did here, has really kind of shaken this world. Lipsitch is the director of a CDC program, seconded from Harvard over to this CDC program. He may have recently left, but he's still listed by the CDC as the director of this program. And as the director of a major kind of institute inside Harvard, he is the elite of the elite when it comes to these questions. That all of this is going on inside Boston, which is its own kind of interesting kind of socio-political dynamic, and so it was, I'm sure, difficult for him to kind of come out as aggressively as he did, and he came out in a measured way, more measured than Ebright. We need both. We need the Malcolm and the Martin, but he knows all of these people, and there is a strong, like, circle the wagons, sentiment in every industry, in every field. And so for him to be willing to come out and say, you know what, actually this BU research shows the flaws in our system. Yep. It ought to be taken extremely seriously.
No, absolutely.
And Democrats have just been so reluctant to even pay any attention to this issue that maybe, look, this guy's the top guy at Harvard. Like, y'all love credentials. Yeah. Like, he's got them. Yeah. Can you listen to him?
Is he the science?
He's not Rand Paul.
Right? Right. Like,
if he's not the science, who's the science?
Right. And so maybe the science disagrees sometimes. Maybe if Anthony Fauci is the science, and there's science that disagrees with the Anthony Faucis of the world, the science can attack itself.
Right. And I think people can look at what BU is saying, look at what the other side is saying here, and decide for yourself. BU's reaction here has not been impressive, and really, should strike fear into people who think that this field can self-regulate, because this clearly shows they absolutely cannot.
As it has taken this defensive posture over the course of COVID, for some understandable reasons, the medical community, the arrogance of the medical community has emerged in some very, very disturbing ways. Got a lot of our money.
So anyway, so what's your point?
All right. Well, during Kamala Harris's clumsy presidential run, she used to talk about her 3 a.m. agenda, which she described as a plan, quote, focused on the issues that keep people up at night. Whatever consultant came up with that was actually onto something, even if their idea was wasted on a doomed candidate. Millions of families are waking up in the middle of the night or sitting at the kitchen table after putting the kids to bed, trying to figure out how to make it all work. That's a quote from Kamala Harris in a 2019 op-ed that argued her plan included, quote, solutions that will have a direct and immediate effect on people's lives, paychecks, and healthcare. Again, the consultant's onto something. It's important that our politics are indeed focused on solving the immediate problems of everyday Americans, not on trumped-up, media-friendly conflicts used to emotionally manipulate voters. Of course, there's really no getting rid of that emotional manipulation, but responsible actors in politics and media should seek to cut through all that noise. So what are 3 a.m. issues? Surely now it's the full slate of economic pains: gas prices, food prices, healthcare, student loan debt. For the average voter, abortion is likely not front of mind as polls open around the country. And yet, take a look at this video from Dearborn, Michigan.
We want to leave the politics out of this. If you're on Facebook, all you see is fear-mongering political rhetoric that this is book banning, censorship, homophobic. All it is protecting our children. We as concerned parents in Dearborn are not tied to the left, to the right when it comes to this issue. And we're not going to be used as pawns for any organization for their own agenda. We're here to protect our children. Do not fall for the political rhetoric on Facebook, on Instagram. Do not fall for the trap, because that's what they want. They're trying to smear us. They're trying to control the narrative. They're trying to say this is homophobic. Listen, there's a book that was banned. It was called This Book is Gay. And I tell you, if the book was called This Book is Straight, we're still gonna go after it. Because it's teaching kids how to go online and have sexual intercourse with others on the internet. This is wrong.
The title referenced in that speech is called This Book is Gay by Juno Dawson. I'm going to read a positive community review from the Progressive Daily Kos, which compared the book to other LGBT books aimed at teens. Quote, Juno goes a bit further, though, offering specific and practical advice on how to find and meet like-minded people for socializing and sex, the reviewer notes. Some of her advice is tailored specifically for teenagers in high school. She frankly describes the different ways gay men and women bring their partners to orgasm. She includes illustrations not of sex acts, but of bodies, less graphic than those in Fun Home and genderqueer graphic novels that feature in other book banning attempts. Okay, so like those books, This Book is Gay has been the subject of parent protests. Here's the section of the book the dad referenced in the viral speech, which reads how sex apps work. You can see on the screen, it's basically an instruction on how to get on a sex app and meet someone. Here's another section that provides instructions on how to perform handies and blowies and much, much more. So is this a dumb culture war blow up or a 3 a.m. issue? In another part of his viral speech, the father turned protest leader in Dearborn said people have been warning him that if he speaks out, they're going to protest your businesses, you're going to get fired from your job. I've got 3 children. My purpose in this world is to protect my kids, and that's all I will do, and nobody will stop me. That's what the dad said. Now, hundreds of members of the Muslim community in Dearborn have come out to school board meetings since September, organizing to keep their kids from accessing books like Dawson's. This is where more culture war issues become 3 a.m. issues. If you're worried about finances for speaking out against a book that provides your 14-year-old with what reasonable people would agree is unhealthy sexual instruction, then this culture war issue becomes an economic one as well. None of that is to say cultural issues can't keep people up at night without also being economic ones. It's merely to point out that we often, too often, think of culture and economics as mutually exclusive areas. This is not an isolated local issue in Dearborn either. This is happening in communities all over the country and with more than just this one book. These questions played a role in Glenn Youngkin's upset last year in Virginia. Parents care about this. For understandable reasons, they take issue with the content of the book and the ease of access for their children, who are already very difficult to protect from violent internet porn. The idea that a public school could be undermining their best efforts at parenting is obviously infuriating. Now, check out this headline from the Washington Post. School board meeting cut short as protests over LGBTQ books grow unruly. All right, so much of the news coverage has included basically no information about the content parents are objecting to, describing it repeatedly as LGBT rather than sexually explicit, which This Book is Gay clearly is. Now, I won't deny a chunk of the religious protesters are likely opposed more generally to LGBT books, regardless of whether they're highly sexualized. The Detroit Free Press reported at one meeting, quote, some of the placards held up read, keep your porno books to yourself, homosexuality, big sin, and if democracy matters, we're the majority. Here's more from the Washington Post. Quote, like other parts of the country, conservative Christians were the first to raise fears about books with LGBTQ content in Michigan School District, which serves the city of Dearborn and part of the Dearborn Heights in the Detroit metro area, the Detroit Free Press reported. They then rallied the significant Muslim population in both cities to join them. All right, so that actually gives credence to what the dad said in his viral speech. This isn't about left or right. It's about parents who don't think these books are appropriate for teenagers and parents who are now reasonably panicked about the mindset that informs our education system, which is fighting to keep This Book is Gay and other titles in libraries. Interestingly, CARE's Michigan organization has been supportive of the parent protesters, while the American Federation of Teachers has been supportive of the books. Reading through weeks of the coverage, I was reminded of a post from Colin Wright's Substack, Reality's Last Stand, this week. It was a pretty nuanced rebuttal by Lisa Celine Davis of John Oliver's recent Last Week Tonight show on trans issues. So while mocking his detractors for getting facts wrong, John Oliver did very much the same. While pointing that out, Davis landed on a deeper point. She listed off what she sees as excesses in Republican anti-trans policies, but then she added, the Democrats, on the other hand, have passed laws that allow children to medically transition without parental consent, sent CPS after parents who don't socially or medically affirm their trans-identified kids, and attempted to criminalize parents who refuse pediatric gender medical interventions. I think it's safe to call these actions on both sides effing insane, which is a term Oliver uses several times, but never for the Democrats. So this is repeated in the media constantly as well. Parents have legitimate reasons to be furious about those books in libraries or about consent laws on transitioning, for instance. Who put those books in libraries? Who passed those laws? It was Democrats, as Democrats in the left more broadly. As Davis wrote, a lot of people on the left are worried about the compelled speech of pronoun announcements and that the left's handling of this issue may cost us the election and with it our democracy. why not take that seriously? She was talking to John Oliver there. Well, back to the dad's point, because taking it seriously from the left either requires meaningfully challenging their priors or risking personal and professional blowback. By the way, it's easy to understand why. Genuine bigotry exists, and decent people want to protect others from it. But people are very upset about the culture right now, and they have legitimate reasons to be upset about it. You may disagree with them, but treating all these parents as bigots or opponents generally of LGBT books pushes us deeper into a hole. And the deeper we go into that hole, the more time we have to spend talking about bizarre teen books than fixing our healthcare system. People aren't wrong to care about both. One of the interesting criticisms of John Oliver, I think, was that Substack post saying, like, dude, you're dismissing all of these critics basically recklessly as people who don't actually care about, for instance, trans teens or the Republican policies that go too far, and that's not productive. Basically, I think that's the crux of this. I mean, obviously, I disagree with the left on much of this, but it's also just wildly counterproductive politically and morally for the left to brush aside everyone as though they're just a bigot and just a culture warrior that doesn't care about the real issues.
And yeah, I think there are a couple different elements of this fight. And I think Democrats are having a hard time kind of sorting out, who is in which faction of it. And so you've got some who, see the more kind of sympathetic cases as perfect weapons for them to wield in their much broader and genuinely bigoted kind of culture war. You have others, who see them as ways to, that can be weaponized for electoral political gain. Then you have others who see them and say, this is just wrong. Let's get together and let's fix this. Like, we don't want this type of explicit content. Mm-hmm. No, like a lot of parents say, I don't want this. If I found this in my kid's bedroom, I would take it from them.
Right.
Say, you're not ready for this.
Right.
And therefore, I also don't want it in the public library. And I think what Democrats have to be able to do is they have to be able to say that obvious things that are true, they have to be able to say that are true.
Right.
And they've had a hard time doing that.
Yeah.
But
it's because the left that you've written about extensively, like some of the really hardened extreme activists on the left that make it difficult to broker any dissent, because that means you're on the wrong side.
Right, because then they lump you in with the ones who are doing all of this in bad faith.
Right.
And so there's just a fundamental lack of trust.
Right.
And I think a lot of the people that are unwilling to, say that a thing that they see as blue, were very late coming around on marriage equality. And shame on them, and they feel ashamed. And so now they're saying, well, I'm not going to be behind again.
Like guilt.
Right.
Interesting.
So I'm going to be way ahead on this next one. Whatever the next thing is, I'm not going to be somebody who's saying I'm just for civil unions or actually being against like marriage equality and civil unions. Because there were a lot of liberals who were, you look at the polling up through, it was losing in 2004 in states.
Donald Trump was much more progressive than most of the Democratic Party until like 2012.
Yeah, he's from Manhattan.
Right.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of those people are now very susceptible to pressure from the activist base saying, because like we remember where you were in 2010 or 2005.
That's really interesting.
And so they're unable to just say, oh, okay, yeah, you know what, maybe that book doesn't belong in the like middle school library.
Instead, the American Federation of Teachers is fighting for the books to stay in the libraries.
And not every single book needs to be in a middle school library. I think, and
not every single book needs to be like banned or taken out of the library. But some of these books are terrible.
But that's the other problem. Then they'll go after like Beloved or other books where you're like, no, okay, there's some difficult literary scenes in Beloved. It's also one of the greatest books written in the 20th century.
Yeah, there's no reason to ban that book. Yeah.
And so when that book and others similar to it, although that's kind of stands out on its own, is wrapped up in this controversy, then it's very easy for a lot of liberal parents to be like, well, this is all just culture war nonsense.
Yeah. And again, like who's passing the laws, like the consent and transitioning laws? Like, it's coming from Democrats, and the Democrats don't want to deal with it, and that's a really interesting explanation as to why they might not want to. But the bottom line is, like, we cannot even embark on basic projects like libraries, public libraries anymore, because we can no longer agree on some very fundamental tenets of like how to function as a society and basic definitions of what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, what's hate, what's not. And it's causing like incredible cracks in the foundation of like the American Republic, basically.
We're joined now by Iranian-American journalist Negar Mortazavi to talk about the latest with the protests in Iran. Negar, thank you so much for joining us. We had said we would also be joined by Hodar Katebi. She's running late. We're still gonna talk with her later, and we'll post that video later. But in order to get this segment up as part of today's show, we wanted to make sure that we had time for it. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And I wanted to start a little bit by talking about the unusual circumstances under which you're joining us this week. You were in the news for a bomb threat that was targeted around a conference in Chicago where you were speaking, and you've continued to receive significant threats. Can you the title, I don't know if you'd call yourself an Iranian dissident, but in general over the last several months, Iranian dissident has not been a very kind of safe occupation around the world, both in Europe and here in the United States. So what has the last week been like for you?
Well, as you said, dissidents, journalists, activists. I'm an exiled journalist, so I've been living in exile since 2009 from Iran. Haven't been able to go back because of the pressure on me from the regime for my work. So, unfortunately, journalists, particularly female journalists, analysts, some academics, activists, have been receiving, it's been an ongoing trend of online harassment over the past years. It's been documented by multiple human rights organizations, particularly my colleagues who work in the Persian media sphere, BBC Persian, other Persian channels are also receiving a lot of this. And the level has been increasing so much. There's been an uptick in the past 4 years with the protests. Also, the irony is that we receive it from both ends. So we get smeared and attacked by the regime as being accused of mouthpieces of foreign governments. If we're US-based, my colleagues at the BBC or friends at the BBC being mouthpieces of the UK government, accused of being mouthpieces of the Europeans, and then by interest groups and some opposition or exiles being accused as being the mouthpiece of the regime. So both ends simultaneously attack us. And, I've been trying to do professional, nuanced reporting, journalism, analysis. At times I've taken break from journalism, have worked with advocacy organizations back into analysis now for a few years and have been focusing on Iran, US-Iran relations for a few years. So I get invited on university panels and shows like yours frequently, and I was invited to speak at the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. The event, because of the threat and the harassment I was getting and the Institute was getting, the event was moved online. And then on the day of the event, which was supposed to be held online, with the student newspaper, I wasn't there in Chicago, but with the student newspaper, the university newspaper, the Chicago Maroon, has reported was that the building or the institute received a threat and they closed the building. And the report says that they sent some student staff home. I also heard from the institute that there were canine dogs present. And the event went on. We went ahead online, nevertheless, but under just a lot of threat and pressure. I'm grateful to the institute for still going on with the event, for supporting me, for continuing this event. To the University of Chicago, the whole entire community was very supportive, but there was also, they received a lot of backlash and emails, and there was a document circulating from an anonymous account online with a sample letter that they were urging just anyone to send this letter to the university, and emails of the staff were circulated online, and they were getting bombarded with these emails and some calls. But I wasn't there, so I don't have any firsthand reporting of this, but the good work has been done by some student reporters of the university on the ground. And also I saw ABC Local and another local outlet in Chicago reporting on the threat that the institute received.
It's always hard, I think, for Americans to especially Americans that are reasonably skeptical of the media, to parse through and cut through the noise, figure out what actually is happening, what they need to know. So, Negar, what do you think Americans, the average American voter needs to know about what is happening in Iran right now? What are the big takeaways that people should be aware of from your perspective?
Well, there is, and this is, I want to again connect it to this story later. This is a byproduct of the brutality that's happening in Iran. A massive amount of violence, brutal violence being committed by the state, by security forces, various different segments of the security forces. Human rights organizations are documenting dozens, tens, I think passing 100 protesters being killed by security forces, shooting with shotguns, with live rounds, sometimes even shooting at people unarmed who are running away. So from behind, largely peaceful settings, very crowded settings. This is, I think, when I saw in the Human Rights Watch report recently, and just unlawful use of lethal force. It's something that the regime has done in the past, but to crack down and suppress protests and dissent. In 2009, mass protests, state used violence to crack down. In 2019, essentially an iron fist. They brought it down in a matter of days, if not weeks. There was a total internet blackout. Hundreds of protesters were killed. Thousands were arrested, many of them given very harsh sentences. And this time around, it's the same. We're seeing protesters being confronted by security forces, either picked up or killed. Some activists and journalists have been arrested. At least 40, I believe, journalists have been documented by the Committee to Protect Journalists who have been arrested, journalists, photojournalists who have been arrested. I've talked to some sources on the ground who are saying they're receiving threatening calls if they're political activists, if they're journalists, to tone it down, to not protest, to not engage in the online conversation, and they're threatening them, security forces, with arrest. So it's a violent and brutal crackdown, and the chants on the street are also against the entirety of the regime, the supreme leader, the Islamic Republic, the corrupt leadership with underlying, political, economic, social, cultural grievances. And at the core of it is also what I find significant is that it's a feminist uprising. It's a feminist revolution with the main slogan being woman, life, freedom, and these iconic images of women and young girls leading many of these protests.
And so earlier this week, we had a guest on, Satara Siddiqui, who you were saying that you're familiar with, who's more part of the conservative wing and more of a regime supporter, though she's was willing to be critical of the morality police. And the case that she was kind of making is that this is being overblown by the Western press. That that in a lot of parts of the country you're not even seeing significant protests as you walk around the city. And I'm curious from
and basically that most women are satisfied with the sort of moral order.
That enough are.
Yeah.
That it's not a cut and dry black and white issue. And so I'm curious from your perspective, from the sources that you're talking to on the ground in Iran, what is the energy level of the protests? How big are they relative to 2019? Are they bigger today than they were weeks ago? What's their trajectory? How would you describe it?
Well, this is seen by Iran watchers. Many of us obviously are doing it from a distance, but as a serious crisis for the regime in a decade, the most serious rounds of mass protests. It spread to every single province in Iran, dozens of cities, religious cities like Qom and Mashhad. The protests were really huge in Kurdistan, in Baluchistan, the ethnic areas where there's also lots of discrimination and suppression by the state against those communities over the years. And also we're seeing a lot of women and girls essentially showing that they're fed up, that this is a watershed moment. Yes, there's also violent repression. There's a lot of brutality. I hear from sources there's a lot of security forces, plainclothes forces on the streets in major cities. So it's difficult to sustain and grow. But we also continue to see images of protests coming more in pockets, but still across the country. So I think what these protests are showing, again, considering the level of brutality and the violence, which prevents a lot of people from essentially braving the bullets and risking their lives, because those who are staying on the street are essentially risking their lives. But what this is showing us is a crisis of legitimacy. We're seeing this chant of no to the Islamic Republic and no to the leaders and no to the system on social media, also among a lot of Iranians who may not be present on the street at the moment, but they support the larger movement. We're also seeing acts of civil disobedience by women. Women who are taking off the hijab, be it in the public, ordinary citizens in a cafe. We have photos published and videos coming out of a grandma crossing the street, a girl having breakfast at a cafe, all without the hijab, which essentially is an act of civil disobedience. And also more high-profile people. There was an actress who appeared in a live interview inside Iran, without the hijab, which was unprecedented. There was an athlete, Nazar Akabi, a rock climber, who appeared in an international competition, officially on behalf of Iran, in an international competition without the hijab. So we're seeing a continuation of these pockets of protest, the legitimacy crisis, and the saying no to the system, to the repression, to the Islamic Republic by a larger population who is expressing it in other ways, online, through the media, and also these acts of individual civil disobedience by ordinary citizens and also prominent figures, celebrities, actors, athletes, and also these prominent figures who are joining the protest or showing solidarity and support to the protesters, say on their Instagram account, football stars, film stars, filmmakers who are posting messages of solidarity. That's also part of the bigger movement. They may not be able to go on the street and join the protest, but when they post it to an Instagram with millions of followers, it gets shared and it goes viral, and that becomes part of the movement.
And obviously, nobody can sort of snap their fingers and expect Iran to become a Western-style democracy overnight. But Negar, what are some concrete things that you think should happen in the future to satisfy some of the demands of people who are taking risks, clearly risks to their personal, professional lives, to protest the regime?
Well, the core slogan of this feminist revolution is woman, life, freedom. And I think it encompasses the demands in three simple words. Women have been dealing with years of discrimination, of double standards, of discriminatory laws, and of state-sanctioned violence, of violent enforcement of these laws. It starts with the dress code, but it's all over in family law, marriage, divorce, child custody, inheritance, in personal and professional lives. Women have to deal with this discrimination. It's also men, women and allies, women, young girls and allies who are coming out essentially finding no other avenue for political change. The Islamic Republic has essentially shown a very rigid response and no other avenue for change for many of these people, millions of Iranians who think that the street is the only avenue where they can pursue in the form of these protests, risking their lives to demand change. In the previous election, the presidential election, the last election last year, all moderate and reformist candidates within the system, so what's considered moderate and reformist within the system, were disqualified, and the president is essentially seen by a big part of the population as a shoo-in candidate by the conservative who had the path cleared for him to become president. The parliamentary election the year before that, similar moderate reformist candidates were disqualified, and essentially the core, as they call it, the hard core of the regime and the more militaristic and conservative and hardline core of the regime is consolidating power, is taking over all aspects of power, isolating their own systems, reformers and moderates, and closing all avenues for change. So that's why you're hearing this chant of an end to the Islamic Republic, an end to the regime by people on the street. It's unclear how exactly that may materialize. I don't want to speculate one way or the other. Is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? But you're just hearing this fed up tone from a lot of Iranians that it's not just the mandatory hijab, it's not just the morality, because sometimes even Iranians, my own friends, watch my interviews and they think that I'm only talking about these issues as opposed to them wanting a change to the entire system. That's necessarily not the discourse here. It's difficult to speculate. I don't want to speculate as far as a crystal ball of what will happen, but we're seeing this as a watershed moment for many Iranians demanding an end to the entirety of this thing. They see it as a corrupt government, repressive a state, and also they see no other avenues for political change.
And if the repression has brought the protests into just pockets of in various areas, there's any epidemiology, as you know, to protests, and they feed off of each other. The bigger they get, the more people then can join them, because there ends up being some kind of anonymity and protection in a large crowd. If you're talking about smaller pockets of protests, then each individual person who goes out is much more vulnerable. It takes more courage to join, some 20 people sometimes than it does to join 200,000 people. And so what's been the effect on people who were kind of who feel this way about the regime and have felt this way and were happy to join, when there are large crowds? What's the effect on people like that now that the crowds are getting smaller?
Well, it certainly has that fear effect, as you said. When people see someone next to them killed or shot or arrested, it does have that impact. Also, we're seeing, again, a lot of courage and bravery. So I want to applaud that. I'm in awe of the courage of these young girls, schoolgirls. I saw a video the other day of elementary schoolgirls. 3 elementary schoolgirls were running down the street chanting "Women, Life, Freedom" and waving their scarf up in the air. So they took it off. High schoolers. The bravery has been incredible, but also the brutality has that impact. I also spoke to some sources on the ground who told me they've heard of ordinary protesters who were identified in protests either by security forces or through images, the filming of their themselves, and then they had their homes raided overnight and arrested. So it's not only activists, it's not only prominent people, it's also ordinary protesters, anybody that shows any form of leadership, even in a small setting. So I heard about this one protester who was an ordinary person, but it seemed like she was leading the chant in one setting of like a dozen people around. And this gets picked up in the images, and then the home is raided at night and the person is arrested. So they're essentially trying to send a message also to the rest of the population, and even to the rest of the protesters, to stop this, that we're coming after you, that we have the capacity to identify you, and the sources and the forces. And what we saw in 2019 was an immediate crushing of these protests. This time around, it hasn't been as immediate, and my reading and some other Iran analysts and reporting that was also reporting in the New York Times is that not the entire force has not been deployed yet. So this could get even worse than this, more brutal, more violent. And it has the effect of essentially either you pick people up, you arrest them, or you threaten them and send them back home. So it does have that arrest. The protests did get crushed in 2019, even though there were mass protests across the country. But the problem is when the grievance is not addressed, when the demands are not addressed, be it economic, political, social, cultural, just the hijab, morality police, or the entirety of the system, even if you send people back home, the next time around, they're going to come back with those grievances and an added layer. So in 2019, the spark was an increase in fuel prices. This time was the death in custody of this young woman. The time before that was an election. There have been teachers joining, lawyers, oil workers, laborers, university students, each with their own pockets of grievances, but also this intersectional community coming together with a lot of overlap.
And Negar, where can people follow your journalism and follow your work?
I have a website where I post. I'm an independent journalist, so I do a lot of interviews like this. I post it on my website on Negar Mortazavi. I also have a podcast. I host and edit the Iran podcast, where we do weekly conversations about Iran, Iranian affairs that go beyond just the headlines in the mainstream media, and have deeper conversations with experts. I'm also very active on Twitter, not on other social media. I have some presence, but on Twitter is my main place where I post my work, my interviews, and also my podcast.
Sounds great.
Negar's written for The Intercept, too.
There you go.
Yes, I have.
Yes.
Well, Negar, thank you so much for your time and for your insights this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, we appreciate it.
All right, well, that'll do it for this Counterpoints Friday.
That's right.
Thank you, everybody, for sticking around.
Yep, we hope you have a great weekend. Enjoy the wonderful fall weather. Hopefully it's nice where you are. And we'll see you back here next Friday. Counterpoints Friday.
See you then.